presentation of Ember's GER 2025. This is the sixth time that Ember's produced a summary of global electricity, comparing this year with the last year. And I just wanted to welcome everyone to this webinar and welcome our guests who are going to help us unpack the contents of this really rich report. I wanted to just some housekeeping as we get going. There is going to be a recording made of this webinar, and that will be uploaded on the Ember website. And the report is now available. It was published this morning, UK time, and that's also on the emberenergy.org website. And if you're posting about it on social media, please could you include the hashtag GER25, which will help people to find it. And then just to say that this, we're going to have a presentation from the Ember team about the contents. We're going to have a discussion with some very distinguished guests. And then we're going to go to a Q&A session. And that Q&A will be, you can find that as a participant, you can upload your questions there. You can vote on your questions, and we'll get through those in a special session after we've heard from our guests. So that's really all from me. I'm Bryony Worthington. I'm the chair of the Ember board, and I'm very delighted to be here today with my special guests. And I'm going to hand over to Ewan Graham, who is the electricity and data analyst who put together a lot of this. And he'll be joined by Nicholas Fulgham, senior data analyst at Ember. Over to you, Ewan, and to Nick.
Thank you so much, Bryony, and yeah, welcome to the launch of the Global Electricity Review 2025. My name is Nick Fulgham, and along with my colleague Ewan Graham, we'll be taking you through the findings in our latest report on the global power sector. We'll start with a quick overview of what's inside of the report this year. So in the Global Electricity Review 2025, we provide the first comprehensive data set and review on the global electricity system in 2024. We're taking a detailed look at the changes in the electricity sector in 2024. We provide analysis on the key trends that are shaping the global electricity transition. And we also include a deep dive into the electricity sector of major countries and regions, as well as the trends for different electricity sources. Now, to do this, we've collected and analyzed the latest 2024 data for 88 countries. And our data also covers 215 countries since 2000, as well as 13 geographies and economic groupings like the EU, OECD, or ASEAN. And this coverage is really what allows us to give the first accurate picture of the electricity transition last year, both on a global and on a country level. And with this, we also published the first fully open data set of electricity generation in 2024. Now, in this presentation, we want to focus on 4 key trends that have shaped the global power sector in 2024. Clean power has surpassed 40% of global electricity generation for the first time since the 1940s, and this was driven by record growth in renewables. Solar has really cemented its role as the engine that's powering this transition, and it's the largest and fastest growing source of new electricity. Fossil generation still saw a small increase, but it was hotter temperatures compared to 2023 that were the main driver of this increase as they drove up the demand for cooling. And then lastly, we show that clean generation is actually set to outpace this higher electricity demand growth. And this is what sets us on a path to falling fossil generation in the long term.
Thanks, Nick. So focusing on our first key finding, clean electricity generation surpassed 40% of the global electricity mix in 2024. So on the left of this chart, we can see the growth of clean power sources over the last 2 decades, with especially rapid growth from wind and solar power in the last 5 to 10 years. And on the right, we can see the share of generation coming from these low carbon sources. Now, the significant increase in renewable generation in 2024 meant that clean power supplied over 40% of global electricity generation for the first time since the 1940s. And for context, back then, the electricity system was 50 times smaller than it is today. And I'd really like to stress just how big that renewables increase was in 2024. So here we can see the annual change in renewable power over the last 2 decades. And in 2024, we saw a major new record increase with substantial rises from solar, wind, and also hydropower. And in fact, the rise that we saw in 2024 was almost 50% higher than it was in 2022, which was the year of the previous record. And if we look at those bright green bars, the rise of solar generation, we can see that the contribution has grown consistently from year to year. And in 2024, solar added nearly 500 terawatt hours of electricity. That's roughly equivalent to the total increase in renewable generation that was seen in the 4 years previously. And focusing now on our second key finding, the rapid rise of solar power has cemented its position as the largest and fastest growing source of new electricity. So comparing changes across all types of generation last year, we can see that solar added more than twice as much to global electricity generation as any other source. And the comparisons are even more striking when you compare it to increases in fossil generation. So it added more than 3 times as much as coal and almost 5 times as much as gas. But it's not just the largest source of new electricity, it's also still by far the fastest growing. Often, when technologies mature, you may expect to see their growth rate slow down. But however, with the record growth in 2024, solar has managed to maintain the high rate of growth of previous years and continues to grow exponentially, doubling roughly every 3 years. In fact, the growth rate in 2024 of 29% was actually the highest growth rate seen in the last 6 years. So solar is showing no signs of slowing down. And what's been really striking this year is the rapid rise of solar isn't just limited to a handful of countries, it's happening across the globe. So here we can see how solar power has developed in many different countries over the last 5 years, from the light green dot in 2019 to the darker green dot in 2024. And as countries move further to the right of this chart, solar gains share in the electricity mix. As they move up, solar produces more electricity in absolute terms. And we've broken this down into 6 buckets according to total solar generation to allow us to show some of the stories happening across both larger and smaller power sectors. Now, there's so much that could be highlighted in this chart, but I'd like to stress 2 to 3 trends for this presentation. So first of all, in some medium-sized power sectors, like Chile, Greece, or Hungary, solar has quickly turned into one of, if not the most important sources of power. Solar is reaching shares above 20%, or in the case of Hungary, supplied a quarter of electricity generation in 2024. In some of the biggest power sectors in the world, like China, Brazil, and Germany, the total amount of solar generation has reached new heights in recent years. Solar was the largest source of new generation in all 3 markets in 2024, and China's solar generation of 834 terawatt hours in 2024 was equivalent to more than the total annual electricity demand of major power sectors like South Korea or Canada. And the last thing I'd like to stress is that geographically, there is also a really wide spread in terms of high solar shares now. So while solar power is rising in countries near the equator, like Brazil, it has also rapidly become a major part of some power sectors in higher latitudes, such as Denmark, Poland, or the Netherlands. And if there's one overall message to take away from this, it's that the rapid boom of solar power is now happening everywhere. And one technology that is increasingly contributing to the growth of solar power is battery storage. In 2024, global installed capacity in battery storage nearly doubled. On the left, we can see how the price for battery storage has decreased significantly over the last decade, with a further dip of 20% seen last year in 2024. And similar to the dynamic of solar power, these cost reductions have enabled rapid growth in the battery storage market, with 69 gigawatts installed in 2024. For context, the total amount installed to date had been 86 gigawatts. And this combination of solar alongside battery storage promises to be transformational to global power systems, allowing countries to integrate much higher shares of solar power into their electricity systems and benefiting more from the cheap power that solar can provide.
Now, despite this record increase in solar power and renewables in 2024, we still recorded a small increase in fossil generation. But what our analysis is showing is that it was hotter temperatures compared to 2023 that were the main driver of this increase as they pushed up the growth in electricity demand through additional cooling needs. Now here we can see the percentage growth in electricity demand in the last 10 years. And 2024 saw the third highest demand growth in the last decade. Demand grew by 4%, and this was also substantially higher than the growth in 2023, when it grew at around 2.6%. Now, the increase in renewables that we can see on the left here was able to meet 3/4 of the growth in demand. That's that gray bar on the right. And solar's record growth of 474 terawatt hours already met 40% of that increase. But because this rise in demand was so large, there was still an increase in coal and in gas generation. But just to put 2024 into perspective here, the rise in renewables and in nuclear power in 2024 would have been enough to cover the increase in demand in all but 3 years in the last 2 decades. So naturally, we wanted to know why demand growth was so high in 2024 and why it was so much higher than in 2023. Now, when we take a closer look at where this growth in electricity demand came from, we found that 2024 was a year where many major electricity sectors like China, the US, and India had really been affected by heat waves, while 2023 had been relatively mild, especially in the summer in and around population centers. And we actually estimate that that difference in temperatures between 2024 and 2023 added more than 200 terawatt hours to electricity demand in 2024, and that's what pushed up demand growth. Now, there's definitely a general global upwards trend of temperatures and more frequent and severe heat waves as a result of climate change. But we really want to stress here that this dynamic in 2024 was largely the result of short-term fluctuations of temperature conditions between the 2 years. And we can also see here that clean electricity demand growth on the left was enough to cover 96% of the non-temperature related growth in demand that we can see in that gray bar on the right. And that means that if temperature conditions in 2023 and in 2024 had remained the same, then fossil generation would have also remained mostly unchanged. Now, despite this small increase in fossil generation, this underlying trend of the rapid expansion of solar power and clean electricity still remains clear. And as a result, we also find that clean generation is still set to outpace this higher demand growth in electricity and thereby lead to reductions in fossil generation in the near future. Even when we're accounting for temperature differences, 2024 definitely still showed structural growth that was higher than the last 10 years. And that in part reflects the growth in emerging drivers of electricity demand from data centers, EVs, and from heat pumps. Now, these sectors are contributing more than twice as much to demand growth as they did 5 years ago, and there's especially strong growth for EVs and for data centers. Now, if we look forward there, the expectations for future growth in electricity demand have been revised upwards as a result. So in their 2023 World Energy Outlook, the IEA still expected 2.7% demand growth to the end of the decade, so to 2030. But in last year's edition, it then revised that upwards to 3.3% for the rest of the decade. Now, when we look at clean deployment and demand growth together, we see that the forecast for growth in clean electricity generation are outpacing even the faster rate of growth of 3.3%. And in fact, that clean electricity growth is fast enough to meet demand growth of around 4.1%. And that's even faster than that elevated growth that we saw in 2024. In the short term, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be a fall in fossil generation in every single year, because weather conditions can always affect the supply and demand, like we've seen in 2024 with the impact of heat waves. But it's that rapid deployment of clean electricity that makes one thing clear for us, is that we're entering the start of a structural decline in fossil generation. And this dynamic between demand growth, clean generation growth, and fossil generation is really made especially clear in China and in India. So for many years, we can see that fossil generation, which is that red line here, has been growing roughly in line with electricity demand because new demand was predominantly met by rising coal generation. But in recent years, India and even more so China have been able to decouple this relationship between demand and fossil generation. And that's thanks to that surge in clean power deployment. Now, China accounted for more than half of the global increase in solar and wind power in 2024. And while the specific year is definitely hard to predict, clean power is already growing so fast in China that 2024 could be the year that fossil generation peaked. And in India, solar and wind projects that are already under construction are already enough to double capacity by 2024. And while we still expect coal generation to grow between now and 2030, it will likely do so at a slower pace than it has done in the past. Now, countries and regions like the EU and the US will definitely have to continue to expand their build out of clean electricity. But it's exactly that turnaround in China and in India, with falls in China and slower fossil growth in India, that will tip the balance on the global trend in fossil generation. And this is what will lead to larger falls over the coming years.
Thanks, Nick. So just to recap, 4 key takeaways from this presentation. First of all, that clean power is cutting into fossil generation's market share and meeting the majority of demand growth, hitting 40% of global electricity generation in 2024. Solar power is already reshaping the electricity system and remains the largest and fastest growing source of new electricity globally. We did still see a fossil generation increase in 2024, for which hotter temperatures were the main driver of this. But looking to the longer term, clean generation is still set to outpace higher electricity demand growth, meaning that the era of fossil growth is coming to an end, even in a world of fast rising demand. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Nick and Ewan, for that super clear presentation. Fantastic charts, as ever. Really wonderful. Thank you both. Right, so now we're going to hear from our respondents, our panelists, and we're delighted to be joined by 3 wonderful guests. We have Sonia Dunlop, the CEO of the Global Solar Council. Welcome, Sonia. We have Michal Brady, who is the Chief of Staff of the Latin American energy organization, OLADE. Is that right? How do you pronounce OLADE?
It's perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. And then we have Beatrice Petrovich, who's a senior energy and climate analyst at Ember. Now, before we start the conversation, could I just remind those online, thank you for joining us. If you have questions or even comments that could be a question, please put those in the chat function, the question and answer function, and then we'll move on to those after we've heard from our panelists. Now, what I want to do is just ask the same question of all 3 of you and get your responses, which is, this is exciting data. It's something that, we've been hoping would happen, that we'd see these big rises. But is there anything here that you've heard today or read in the report that was particularly surprising to you that you wanted to highlight? Or also, perhaps what are some of the challenges as well that you can see in the future or in the present term? So I'll start with Sonia, if that's okay. Over to you, Sonia.
Thanks, Bryony, and thank you so much for the whole team at Ember for producing such fantastic analysis, as always. I mean, in terms of the one takeaway that for me hits the hardest is really the one about how that, a whole chunk of that increase in electricity demand, I mean, we can, attribute it to the part that's also been provided by fossils, is down to increased temperatures. And it really, to me, what that says is that we're entering a new era. Of course, we're entering the dawn of the solar era, to quote The Economist last year, but we're also entering a new era where climate impacts are starting to bite. And we need to be thinking about how the energy system can adapt to that hotter and more volatile and more, disaster prone world as well. And I'm very aware of 2 things. First of all, that solar and air conditioning are a pretty good match. They're not a perfect match. Solar and storage and air conditioning are an even better match, of course. But the 2 have pretty similar, demand and supply profiles. And so I think there is huge potential to really kind of co-install and co-roll out solar storage and air conditioning partly because that's the first thing that people buy when they pull themselves out of poverty, but partly also as a way of protecting ourselves from the worst climate impacts in those sunbelt regions of the world. But also just how critical it's going to be to drive forward progress on sustainable and efficient cooling all over the world. And we as the solar industry, obviously, you know, we are growing massively, but we need to be thinking about solar for productive uses. And solar for cooling is definitely one of those.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sonia. I'm going to pass to you now, Michal. What struck you, and what challenges do you see?
Well, thank you, and it's an excellent report. So thank you for all the work. So I think from our perspective, from OLADE perspective, we should be closely monitoring the accelerating transition to cleaner energy, and particularly in Latin America, where renewables are growing faster than anticipated. But at the same time, we must prepare for unexpected challenges in terms of energy security and pay more attention to last year or maybe last month's events in some countries regarding power outages in some countries of the regions, as Argentina, Chile, Panama, Ecuador, and Cuba. Those are many examples, sadly. And we know renewable energy brings many opportunities and benefits, but also implies challenges that are not appropriately addressed in some cases, and that's something we have to look for.
Thank you so much. And yes, we're going to now pass to Beatrice. Would you like to comment as well, please?
Sure. Now, it was a pleasure reading this report. Really, it's packed with insights. I invite you to read through. It's hard to choose, but one example that I really like is the one about battery storage that's becoming this game changer for solar, and is real. Costs are declining. Look at the chart with 20% fall in battery pack cost last year, 20%. It's huge, and it's been a trend. And also this new technologies that for batteries that, like, it's just economies of scale, but also new technology that eliminate the needs of rare material, nickel and cobalt, so more resilient. And so check out for the report, there's an example from California. It says that 3 years ago, batteries were only 2% in meeting the evening peak of demand. So a tiny bit of solar was shifted to the evening. But now, on a regular basis, it's 20%. So 20% of evening demand covered by solar that was so abundant during the midday that you can shift it to the evening. So really exciting. I see that coming in other regions. So and the challenge, to answer your question, will be to make sure that we eliminate all existing barriers for this to happen. Storage is one tool, but we have demand flexibility, smart cooling, smart electrification. So yes, the challenge is there, but opportunity is very big. So I think very optimistic view here.
Was there anything about your comments that you each made there that you wanted to pick up on? Anything that that you feel like you wanted to expand on or ask questions of each other before we move out to the wider audience?
Bryony, I think the point that Michal made on energy security, and I would include resilience, right? Resilience, adaptation, and resilience to all kinds of external shocks is a really important one. And I think we really need to be thinking hard and talking about how moving to a more renewable, more distributed, more small scale electricity system with, a huge number, 25 million solar homes or solar plus storage homes around the world, also brings resilience to communities, resilience to natural disasters, resilience to all, conflict situations, and brings a completely different type of energy security to countries as well, where shocks, energy security crises will, can be, you have years to resolve them rather than days, as you did in the old fossil fuel era. And we really need to be thinking more about how to both enhance that, but also how to drive that and rethink how we define energy security as well.
Thank you. Michal or Beatrice, did you have anything you wanted to add to the comments?
Maybe just shortly, I was very glad that energy resilience, energy security was mentioned, because here is a big benefit that decentralized renewables can bring. Bringing the example from Europe, the region I'm from, it's really renewables are becoming already a defense strategy, a resilience strategy. It's about the climate crisis, but it's also about energy independence, it's about security in a wider sense. So yeah, really true. We need to define energy security, redefine, and renewable have to be at this table for everyone to benefit. So great point about that.
Michal, I had just wanted to take a level deeper on your comments about the fact that we did see those blackouts occurring, and certainly some of them hit headlines, even I heard about them here in California. But what was the mood? What was the response? Was it, okay, this just means we've got to invest more in our grid resilience, adaptation of the grid, and perhaps more resilience from that perspective? Or was there a political pushback that you saw as well?
Well, I think it's very important to understand that the causes of these outages and blackouts, it's very different. We have different stages in terms of the energy transitions in Latin America. So we're talking about Ecuador. I'm based in Quito. I didn't experience the 14 hours blackouts a couple of months ago, but this is, of course, this has to be with leaning on hydropower for a long time, and this is the case for a lot of the countries in the region. That's why we talk about the hydropower as a blessing, but also as a curse if you don't have the measures and the policies to diversify your matrix. And you have the breakouts and the outages in Chile that it was very surprising, or maybe in Argentina, where they very advanced in the transition. They have a lot of renewable energies, but as I said, this also brings a lot of challenges, because we're all convinced about the need and how great clean energy is, but okay, this is something that we didn't have with coal or gas, and we have to address that. And that's why infrastructure in transmission lines, it's something that it's very important from now on. But as I said, the reactions and the measures, it's different in every country, because the causes of this situation, it's very, very different in any case.
Thank you both. I want to just see if we could unpack a little bit more from your perspectives what the reasons are for this big increase in clean. Obviously, it's a mixture always, but if you could pick out some of the drivers that you thought were particularly relevant, maybe just the fact that solar is very fast, but what from each of your perspectives, what were some of the things that got us to this position last year? Maybe starting with Sonia.
Sure, happy to. I mean, yes, obviously the cost of solar has come down 90% over the last 15 years, and it's very fast to deploy. It's very scalable. It's very versatile, right? You can build 5 gigawatt solar farms out in the desert, or you can also install a couple watts in an off-grid solar and storage system in a part of sub-Saharan Africa that doesn't yet have access to electricity, and everything in between, of course, right? Commercial and industrial rooftop solar is really pushing a huge amount of deployment for businesses who are exposed to high electricity prices, as was the case in Pakistan last year when they saw a huge solar rush of 17 gigawatts. People, regular households all over the world are saving money on their electricity bills thanks to solar on their roof and battery storage in their garage or basement or whatever it might be. Balcony solar means that now people who live in flats have access to just plug-in solutions. Floating solar means that we can also cover water bodies and reduce evaporation. So that it's an incredibly versatile technology that's modular, that obeys the same kinds of rules in terms of mass manufacturing and cost reductions as basic computer microchips, and can be installed everywhere in the world. And it really, I think one of the insights from the presentation was a really good one, that this really is happening all over the world. Yes, most of the deployment so far is in Europe, North America, China, a lot in India as well, but this is truly a global technology that every corner of the world can benefit from, including the least developed countries in the world, including conflict areas such as Syria and Lebanon and Ukraine and Gaza and everything else in between. You know, when people are subject to blackouts or to any other kinds of uncertainty, they can fall back on a small solar panel with a bit of luck. But what we need in order to really take this to the next level is maximum system flexibility all over the world. And that's short duration battery storage, long duration, other types of storage, pumped storage, hydro, which is just absolutely critical as well to providing that flexibility, flexible demand, and of course, cross-border long distance grid interconnectors as well to share across regions. Thanks.
Thank you, Sonia. Same question for you, Michal. What do you think has really contributed to getting us to this position today?
Thank you. And I think, first of all, well, Latin America and the Caribbean are not just any player in the global clean energy transition. We are leaders. In 2024, 69% of our electricity was generated from renewable sources, nearly double the global average. And countries like Brazil, Chile, and others are proving it's possible to meet growing energy demands while expanding clean power, and particularly solar and wind. So what's behind this regional success? I think first, and maybe the most important one in our case, is our vast array of natural resources. Our region is blessed with some of the best renewable energy resources in the world. Chile, Mexico, and Brazil enjoy some of the highest solar radiation levels in the world, while regions like Patagonia in Argentina and Northeast Brazil benefits from consistent high-speed wind. This provides a solid foundation, of course, for developing large-scale solar and wind projects with high capacity factors. Second, and I think it's very important too, we have a strong legacy on hydropower. As I said before, many of our countries have long relied on hydroelectricity, and this has created a grid infrastructure well suited for integrating variable renewables, but maybe most importantly, a public and political culture that supports clean electricity. As a region, we are not starting from scratch, but building on decades on renewable leadership. Third, maybe solar markets are trending towards our side, and this is worldwide. Solar and wind have become the cheapest sources of new electricity in many Latin American and Caribbean countries. And this is largely thanks to competitive auctions that have brought prices down dramatically. For instance, we have seen record low price bids for solar energy in Chile and Brazil, and some of the lowest globally. And maybe as a fourth point, it's policy innovation, that it's something that it's very important too. Governments across the region play a key role by developing reverse auctions, offering long-term contracts, and introducing forward-looking legislation. Another example, again, maybe Chile's energy transition law and Brazil's national decarbonization strategies. These are excellent examples on how clean policy signals can attract significant private investment. So, of course, however, to fully scale these successes and unlock broader socioeconomic benefits, we must address some other needs. I don't know if you want me to address those now or maybe later.
Well, let's pause there and we'll come back to that. But thank you. Because I wanted to turn to the Ember team, and we couldn't talk about a global report without talking about China. I suppose I'm interested. Perhaps Sonia and Michal also, just to what extent is this a story about China? Not just China's domestic installing of clean, but also its exports, which have been increasing. So maybe Nick or Ewan, or Beatrice, you could offer, maybe Nick, I don't know, a quick response on that, and then we'll turn to the rest of the panel.
Yeah, absolutely. So China's role in the transition has, if anything, increased in recent years. And the one number that we point to this year is that it added more than half of the additions in wind and solar generation in the world. So this is an absolute vast scale of additions, particularly in solar power. So if we just look at capacity installations, 2024 nearly tripled the installations in 2022. And so we're really seeing an expansion that not only no one really predicted it to be on this scale, but it is also something that should give confidence to other countries that are in a similar position where they have rising electricity demand growth, that this can be met with an expansion of clean power. We talked in the presentation about this rapid rise on a global level already getting close to meeting that overall demand rise. But in China, we actually have the same situation where we also had heat waves in 2024. And we looked at that and accounted for that increase in temperatures. And actually, the underlying demand increase was also met purely by an increase in clean power. So this global dynamic is very much reflected in China, and China is so emblematic of many of the trends that we see in other countries as well.
Thank you, Nick. Any other comments, particularly from the sort of export perspective? How much of this Latin American success story is coming from imports? Michal, do we know roughly what that situation is?
Sorry, can you
I'm just thinking, to what extent does this rollout of solar in Latin America link back to cheap manufacturing in China and the importing of that, or that's enabled this?
A big part of the prices going down, it's basically because of the technologies and coming from China and decreasing prices. I think we own in some way a big amount of the responsibility for the low prices to the China industry, specifically in terms of solar.
Thank you. Anybody else from the Ember team? I don't know if Beatrice or you wanted to comment.
Just on the sort of exports of renewable technologies point, I think it's been really striking looking at how exports of solar PV to regions such as Africa and the Middle East, which have historically had very low uptake of solar and wind, despite having vast potential for the resources. In the last 2 years, we've actually seen exports of solar PV from China to both those regions triple, with rapid growth on display in markets such as South Africa, Nigeria, and Saudi Arabia as well. So definitely sort of signs of increased growth in new markets as well. And it is sort of Chinese technology exported that is helping to drive that.
And I'm guessing that's true. Sorry, Sonia, yeah.
And if I can come in on this as well, Bryony, because I completely agree with what's been said. And it's amazing also how in Africa, we published a big report on the African solar and storage market the other day. It's almost storage driving the solar rollout, which is sort of reversing the way we've thought about it over the last 10 years. I think first of all, the massive deployment of solar and other clean technologies in China is a very good thing and is contributing to that monumental milestone they're about to get to of China potentially reaching peak power sector emissions this year or next. Fingers crossed. I think so we represent all the big Chinese solar panel manufacturers as well. And of course, the interesting thing there is that a lot of them are actually financially, walking a bit of a tightrope and actually experiencing some quite significant losses in terms of their operations. Now, of course, they do have access to lots of cheap inputs, and so they're managing to keep going. But we are watching carefully for signs of consolidation and signs of kind of a reorganization, shall we say, of the Chinese industry, because there are a large number of smaller manufacturers that may well get gobbled up by some of the big players like Jinko and Trino and GCL and JA and Tongwei and so on. But the other thing that's happening in China, of course, and I'm heading there next week to find out more, is that they're going through their own electricity market design reform, potentially about to go through a sort of process that might be vaguely similar to a sort of light form of market unbundling. And we'll have to see how that affects deployment of both rooftop and utility scale solar and storage, and of course see how the latest, we are very aware of trade barriers on solar PV, particularly obviously being a barrier to maximizing deployments in many markets around the world, and see how that evolves as well. But I agree, China has really done the world a huge favor by spotting a market opportunity in the early 2000s, investing in a big way, making the most of its ability to manufacture at scales that many other countries can't even imagine. And what we need to be thinking about now is thinking about what does a global industrial strategy look like for the manufacturing of solar and storage? What would be a global, resilient but really low cost supply chain look like, and how can we craft some kind of compromise so that all parts of the world get what they need in terms of energy security and that a slice of the supply chain, while still building on the immense economies of scale that China has to offer in solar storage, EVs, wind, and everything else.
Great, thank you all. You touched there on at the end on EVs, and I just wondered if we could have a quick round around the question of the fact that obviously demand is up, and the report, very sort of clearly talks about the impact that temperatures had on that. But there are these underlying trends, both in terms of temperatures, but also in terms of electrification and the now increasing use of electricity in transport markets and in heat markets. And I wondered if we had any comments about, certainly it feels as if this is a new era of the electron, and there's going to be an increasing demand from that displacement of fossil in other sectors. So I don't know if anyone wants to pick up, how we're going to be thinking about fossil peaking is not just going to be constrained to the electricity market rate, because this electricity is now displacing in other sectors. Nick, don't know if you want to kick things off.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, if we look at the underlying growth, that structural growth or non-temperature related growth, we are at 3.3% for the last 2 years, and that's a significant step higher than sort of the 10-year average, which was around 2.5%. And a large part of that is new drivers of demand. And obviously, when we look within the power sector, we sometimes get a little bit scared when demand accelerates or demand goes up. But demand growth in and of itself, especially for electricity, is not necessarily a bad thing. So when we see demand rising for EVs, like you said, it directly displaces fossil fuel usage outside of the power sector. So when we're moving inefficient processes like driving cars with internal combustion engines, if we move those over to being powered by electricity, we're having a huge efficiency gain. And we do need to look at that calculation, not just within the power sector, but in the total fossil fuels avoided. And that's really where demand growth for electrification should be seen separate than the fears of runaway demand growth within the power sector as a whole. So the power sector is actually holding a lot of the keys for the transition of the entire energy system, so not just the power system by itself. And that really will be an accelerator and a driver. So we might see slower falls in fossil generation than in a world where there is no transition to EVs. But the total balance sheet here is much more positive. So we would always take a smaller fall in fossil generation in the power sector if it means that we're rapidly decarbonizing transport and home heating at the same time.
Anybody else want to comment? Otherwise, I think it's probably time to go to the Q&A, which I would encourage anyone else who's still on the line to ask any questions. Okay, right. So Perhaps we'll start with the hard one first. So Jaakko Heikkinen has asked, while economics and technology are driving change to renewable energy, politics seems to be turning against it. What can be done to win more public support for this transition? It's a huge topic, but who wants to kick us off? Michal, maybe? I don't know. Have you managed to turn the politics around in Latin America?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, maybe this is not the case in many countries in Latin America. And this is mostly because many of them, I'm from Chile, for example, we don't have fossil fuels resources. So the decision, it's easier in some way because it's the only way possible. And now it's the cheapest way possible. So the deployment of renewable energies, it's the way, and there's agreement in many of Latin American countries that that's the path we are following. But it is a challenge, and mainly because environmental permits, it's every day even harder. It's taking a long time in many countries, and this is something the industry have mentioned several times. But when we are advancing in the energy transitions, these requirements, environmental requirements, are getting more and more hard. So this is something, of course, politically, it's difficult to address, but I think there is a broad consensus that renewable energy, not only because, as I said, there is no other options, but it's because it's the cheapest option. So it's the right way to do. I think it's in most of our countries, that's the way we see it.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if Sonia wants to comment, but also anyone on the Ember team. And when we talk about politics, we're really talking about Western politics. Really, we're talking about the USA and we're talking about Europe. And we should probably put an advert out for the Ember USA report that came out a month ago, which is the first time that Ember's looked at the North American region, or USA specifically, at a national and state level. And that does seem to be where a lot of the political pushback is happening. But Nick or Ewan, have you got any comments on that particular aspect of this question?
Yeah, I think it's really striking, actually, seeing kind of the gap opening up between what sort of consumers and businesses are doing on the ground in the US when it comes to technologies like solar, and the actions taken by the administration in recent months. I mean, solar power in the US as well is the fastest growing source of new electricity, and much of that is being installed in red states like Texas. And actually, last month was the first time that clean power supplied more than 50% of the US's electricity. So I think in the light of that, you can see there is a bit of a gap between kind of sentiment in the market and actually sort of the actions of the administration. And I think the risk here is that obviously a lot of countries, as Michal's laid out, for instance, in Latin America, but also in Europe, are increasingly turning to clean power just because it is the cheapest and best way to meet rising power demand. And so there is a risk that sort of the US becomes more left behind in that sense.
And Beatrice, from a European perspective, what are we seeing from Europe's got some pretty challenging legislated targets for the whole region. So how is the politics there?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think despite, like in Europe, we saw right-wing parties in power, but nevertheless, the pace of the transition to clean energy has continued, right? So because it's not just happening because of climate reason, it's happening for security reason. And Europe learned the hard way during the energy crisis with Russian gas input being cut and gas prices going to the ceiling. So I think it's not just climate, it's security, and my panelists already say that it's affordability is actually a cheap way to get power. And let me say something on the buy-in for the transition, which I think is a key important. We should not forget that anytime. I think it's important that this renewable power is just bring benefit to consumers and businesses to see that. And I think flexibility, storage, demand flexibility, smart electrification have a role to play, because really like make the most of renewable power, which is cheap, affordable beyond windy and sunny days. So that will be key really to just get the most, like reward consumers to switch their consumption when renewable plentiful, take the most from like stored renewable power. Really key to get the buy-in from citizens and businesses that we already believe in renewable power, has been said already with the US case. So yeah, so flexibility can really help with the buy-in by benefiting consumer beyond sunny and windy days.
Thank you so much. Just switching topics then, I think, and perhaps Sonia, if you had any comments, you can bring them into this reply. But Barnaby Windsor has asked, are there any structural challenges that this curve, this sort of, we seem to be, the chart shows is we're moving into exponentiality, we're doubling, every 3 years. What is this going to, what are the headwinds? Is there a structural thing that might stop this? And we have an anonymous question, which is similar, which is, are there things like cannibalization or falling capture rates because you're putting solar into less sunny places? Does that start to slow it, or is this rise, can it continue? Sonia, what do you think?
For sure, those grid integration risks around the risk of cannibalization, that we might eat our own lunch by pushing down power prices to negative or to zero at times when we are generating, or the risk of that we are going to be curtailed due to grid capacity. Absolutely, that's a structural risk, and we have to address that by maximizing storage, maximizing flexibility, maximizing flexible demand and electrification, and all those EVs and heat pumps that were mentioned in the slides in many ways are sources of flexibility. But as some analysts say, the best cure to high prices is high prices, right? When there are spikes in electricity prices, or indeed troughs as well, it's amazing how many innovative businesses step in and make the most of that by installing batteries and so on to fix the problem. In terms of the politics of the transition, I would really agree with a lot of what's been said. As the drivers of clean power rollout become largely the economics of the projects themselves rather than policy decisions made in the energy ministry, we are becoming hopefully more and more resilient to changes in the whims and wishes of various politicians. And so even though we still need some major kind of electricity market design reform, what the White House thinks isn't that important anymore. There are 7.1 million solar installers around the world who are going to get on with installing those projects for their customers, whether or not Donald Trump likes it or not. And so in a way, I think we're becoming policy resilient. And that is really, really encouraging. Also, if you want to win hearts and minds all over the world, whether you're in a democracy or not yet in a democracy, the way to do it is with rooftop solar. It is the most tangible way that every single voter, consumer can understand, and that they can also benefit from the clean energy transition, that they can bring down their bills month by month. So we're really trying to set out a new campaign, thinking of new targets for 300 million solar homes around the world, making sure it's easy for every single household around the world to access solar and storage, access low-cost finance, get easy permitting, have access to revenues from the wholesale market, from grid services markets, and so on. And we're building a new kind of electric protocol to help guide the design of electricity markets into the future, to really be able to make the most of that behind-the-meter people power that is what will ultimately win the politics of the energy transition as well.
Thank you so much. I mean, you mentioned that we might be becoming policy resilient, but we've got a question from Marcus Book here, Sonia, if you could quickly answer, which is specifically about China and changes in solar and wind regulations in June of this year. with a new price model. Is that going to see a dramatic change in deployment in the second half of this year, do you think, and forward?
We're not expecting a dramatic change. We are aware of this. This is the kind of there are electricity market design reforms coming in. There is some sort of almost some form of unbundling, but we're not expecting any massive changes. The domestic demand in China is still very strong. They obviously also have a huge, internal industrial strategy incentive to keep that strong, and a lot of low-cost finance as well to throw at the problem, and so we are still expecting the market to remain strong. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we're running out of time, but I've got a couple of technical questions for you, Michal, about Brazil and the sort of grid access questions. I don't know if you want to take those. There's a first come, first served grid connection queue, like there is in many countries. Sometimes this can create challenges. It does create challenges because it's not top-down logical. It's just developer-led. And sometimes not the best projects get the access. And so I don't know if this is from Trigger Singh, who's asked these two questions about Brazil, if you could take a look at those.
Actually, I'm not very familiar with the specific case of Brazil, but just picking up on Sonia's comments, I think it's important not only to take these technologies and prices to the industry and to the market, and to the people, but also socioeconomic inclusion. I mean, we must ensure that clean energy investment reach rural and underserved communities. And clean electricity is not only, from our perspective, it's not only about decarbonization, but about development, resilience, and equity too. So that's just what I wanted to comment.
Excellent. Well, thank you to everyone who's asked questions, and apologies if we didn't get to every single one. I will start to wrap up now, but I wanted to give everybody on the screen just an opportunity to sum up in a 30-second soundbite how they're feeling about the year ahead and what we think we might see in GR 2026, which will come around faster than we think. So perhaps starting with you, Beatrice, and then we'll just do a quick rapid fire and then we'll finish. Thank you.
Yep. So thanks. I hope to see a nice chapter on wind. This year there was a new record high for wind, but we know that underlying wind installation were very strong this year, and wind is expected to maybe do much better next year. So looking forward to like a wind chapter next year.
Great, thank you. Let's hope the industry listens. Over to you, Michal.
So in Latin America, the highest increase 2024 was geothermal, almost 50%. So this is something we would like to see even more next year. Solar and wind, we know it's gonna be important too. 40%, almost both of them. So we know it's gonna keep like that. But what we would like to see with these trends, it's of course flexibility of the electrical system. We need more flexibility to take all the advantages of these renewable sources.
Thank you. Sonia.
I would love to see a declaration that we are on track to deliver the global tripling of renewables target by the end of the decade, and also obviously the doubling of energy efficiency. You know, I'm involved. I'm also vice chair, as well as being CEO of the Global Solar Council. I'm vice chair of the Global Renewables Alliance, where all the different renewables technologies have come together, and we really need that whole mix. We need new hydro and pump storage hydro. We need long duration energy storage. We need a huge boost to wind deployment and geothermal and so on. And so really seeing that mix across all those technologies backed up with storage and flexibility would be fantastic. We're not yet totally on track to delivering the tripling of renewables, and we need to get there within the next 12 months really. And so that's the key test for me.
And Ewan, your wishes.
I think it would be amazing to see battery storage sort of take center stage in the way that we've seen with solar power over recent years. So both in terms of how big a role it's playing in some markets. We have a statistic in the report looking at California that Bayer mentioned, and it's already out of date because so far this year, batteries are supplying close to a third of the evening peak in California now. But also widening and taking more of a foothold in more markets. I think especially in Europe, we can expect to see sort of stronger uptake of battery storage in the years to come.
And finally, Nick, yes, what's your predictions for 26?
Yeah, it's the growing role of electrification. If anything, it takes some of the pressure off of this mythical almost fall in fossil generation within the power sector, because we know that electricity that's growing is going towards making other sectors of the economy more efficient. So this is a really exciting development that we will be watching over the next year. But there is something to be said about hitting that milestone where we will finally see larger falls in fossil generation, because there is a symbolic nature to this. And it is important that both the renewables industry, but then also the fossil fuel industry really see the writing on the wall. Sometimes for people who work in renewables or even in solar, you almost can't believe the trajectory that the industry has been on over the last decade. And so this would really cement that. And on the other side, on the fossil fuel industry, it would also really cement that the writing is on the wall, really, that this is now a sector in decline and not a sector that is looking for long-term growth. And so, yeah, definitely hoping that this milestone will come to pass in the near future.
Well, thank you. I think all that remains for me to do is to thank you all for joining this session, this webinar. Thanks to those who joined online and those who submitted questions. Thank you to the team, for our guests, and to all the team behind the scenes who helped bring this webinar together, because I know it takes a lot of work. So yes, thank you everyone. Really wonderful to share this time with you. Everybody can get the report from the Ember website. And if you are on social media, please do spread the word, hashtag GER 2025. And we'll look forward to seeing you again this time next year, when we'll be looking again back at hopefully another stellar success from clean energy, helping us both increase our security, reduce costs, and of course that small thing of tackling climate change. Okay, thank you everybody.